Okay, so we'll get started. So my first question is for Ella. So the Who Gets to Tell Australian Stories report quotes the 1991 National Inquiry into Racist Violence, which brought up concerns of media representation at that time. So the quote says that the employment of more people from Aboriginal and non-English speaking backgrounds in the media industry generally would help to sensitise the media to issues of concern to these groups and contribute to more informed and more realistic reporting. So despite the fact that in 1991 this concern was outlined, we still have a long way to go today in 2020. So what are the advantages and disadvantages of being an Indigenous Australian working as a journalist, and how do you combat those disadvantages?
I mean, I think I've been pretty lucky in a way, because I think I've come in at a time where people are really seeing the value in hiring Indigenous people in particular to cover their Indigenous affairs rounds. But I think there's this great crop of young Indigenous journos coming up that I've been really lucky to come in at a convenient time. So I think particularly in the role I'm in at the moment, for example, at the Herald and the Age, I've kind of just been given this blank slate to kind of make this whole project my own for a year, which I think a couple of years ago just would have been fairly unheard of. There wasn't an Indigenous round before myself and another Aboriginal photographer came on board last year. So I guess I've probably benefited from a lot of people before me who fought really hard to create pathways for Indigenous reporters coming through. That's probably the advantage for me. I suppose, and I also, being a fair-skinned Aboriginal person, haven't had to face that kind of discrimination based on skin colour. So that's something I can't really speak to from my personal experience, but have no doubt in my mind that when you look at that report and you see how, predominantly white, particularly the executive and the news directors are across the country, I have no doubt that will come into play. And particularly, I think, when we're talking about hiring processes and stuff like that, and I think even in those mainstream organisations, there can sometimes be a view that if someone's politics are too radical or they don't quite fit the mould, that, you have to fit a certain mould sometimes to get into these very coveted positions. So there are plenty of disadvantages. I think I've been quite lucky so far in my career that I haven't had to grapple with too many of those in terms of getting into the industry.
Yeah, thank you for that. So my next question is for Emma. So the report outlines that 77% of respondents for a survey they conducted for people with diverse backgrounds believe that having a diverse cultural background is a barrier to career progression. And to add to that, more than 75% of presenters, commentators, and reporters have an Anglo-Celtic background, while only 6% of presenters, commentators, and reporters have either an Indigenous or non-European background. So while they did focus primarily on representation on screen, I do still think it's a good snapshot of what our media industry is like as a whole. So, after hearing these statistics, how can people of colour decide to pursue journalism as a career despite this lack of representation? And I'd also love to hear a little bit about how you decided to pursue this career.
Sure. So I think for me, I always grew up knowing that the media industry would be predominantly white because that's what I saw. I mean, those are like the bylines that I saw. So from the moment I decided that, I want to write, I want to do nonfiction writing, maybe journalism, kind of knew what I was getting into. But because I really wanted to get into the industry, I was always just scouting and looking out for people of color, people from underrepresented backgrounds that I could, as a kid latch onto and hold up as inspiration in some way. And in a lot of ways that made me turn to, like indie press, a lot of magazines from overseas, zines, like anyone who wrote and did anything that I would like to do, I kind of held up as inspiration. So, I mean, I think it's a little bit easier for people now to be able to look out for diverse reporters. There's a few of us here today. So especially online, spaces more new publications that are being run by younger people often have diversity as a focal point. So I think for people wanting to get into journalism today, like that inspiration is like a little bit easier to find.
Yeah. So you mentioned that you, when you started off, you went to international publications. How did you find, if you could compare between those international publications and the places you worked here, was there a different dynamic working with just people from different countries?
Oh, so I should clarify that I meant I was reading a lot more international publications,
Okay, no
but I
worries.
wasn't necessarily pitching towards them.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think in terms of like, when I was a teenager, I was reading things like Rookie, and that was maybe one of the only publications that I first read that even talked about Asian American identity in particular, and published more personal stories like that. But yeah, I mean, in Australia, I think like Liminal magazine is an example of an independent publication that is specifically dedicated to Asian Australians, and I know there's like others that are dedicated to different diverse backgrounds. So I think, yeah, I pitched to them, and I've been able to contribute to them as well.
Yeah, thank you for that. So my next question is for Jarad. So the report I've been referencing focused on cultural diversity. They didn't collate any data on the disabled people who work in media institutions across the country, which is interesting because, at the moment we're in a climate where diversity of disabled people is unfortunately often second to cultural diversity, linguistic diversity, or diversity of socioeconomic background, for example. However, that makes you think, when will a detailed investigation like the Who Gets to Tell Australian Stories report be conducted in regards to the needs and experiences of disabled journalists? So I would love to know, how have you combated being, one of the very few journalists who can represent your experience, also touching on the intersectional experience that you would have personally as someone from the LGBT community? And have you ever felt any added pressure to portray a specific narrative or image?
Oh, I don't know how to condense all those parts of your question, but I think the only way we're going to have any accurate data or analytic analysis or measurements about how many people who identify as having a disability or impairment being employed or being hired in any mainstream or independent newsroom is when we figure out how we can actually get people to wanting to be considered as being considered as having enough talent and experience and put it more in the way of putting it out if they have enough gravitas or tenacity to put themselves out there to wanting to work in this line of work. With me volunteering, I will call myself a freelance journalist. I not paid. I might occasionally get a little bit of money if I get asked to write a op-ed article for a particular online news outlet. But within my role with The Wire, which is a national independent current affairs radio show, which has been broadcasting since February 2004. It's been going on for 16 years, can you believe it? And with me being one of the only visible contributors with a disability who identifies and is not embarrassed or ashamed of putting it out to any prospective interviewee or even interviewees, that I do have a disability. So my style of journalism is not like someone else who is neurotypical or able-bodied with regards to their language and their tone and their whole, and their even their mannerisms and body language can be very articulate and not and it's not very distinct to other people who do engage in these situations where you're wanting to gather information and from the subject who you're trying to give their own perspective or their input about a particular news story. So what it is that I want to get what it is that I'm hoping to get, if in the future I want to take myself out from community radio and try and try and see if anyone will want to employ me with any other media organisation or conglomerate. I would want them to have a comprehension or a good, clear understanding about identity and about intersectionality, because a lot of us in our community, in both communities, being disabled, and as I am on the autism spectrum, I have been since I was diagnosed as a 5-year-old, and also for me being openly gay as I have been for the last 10, 11 years since I come out, and told nearly everyone that I've known, and even that, you still had to keep on doing the whole charade of announcing to everyone that you're not heterosexual. So unfortunately, disclosure really plays a part in making yourself be noticed and to bring more of a visible presence in making out that you can be a good asset and even a valuable attribute for you for any organization that wants to hear diverse intersectional stories and perspectives about how it is to not be like everyone else, who is not the predominant, not being the predominant demographic. As we all know, it is Celtic, Anglo-Celtic, white Australian.
Okay, thank you for that. So my next question is for Ryma. So while you don't currently work as a journalist, you are employed at a media institution, and the Media Diversity Report investigated people who work in newsrooms as a whole as well, not just the journos. So the report found that 82.7% of the Australian entertainment and media workforce were monolingual. So that tells you a lot about the types of people that are working there, or the demographics, I should say, of the people that are working there. So how do you think your presence in these historically white spaces can positively impact the next generation of journalists and people working in Australian media institutions as a whole?
Yeah, that's actually quite an interesting question. And to be honest, I think at the ABC, it is a work in progress. There's a kind of a tongue-in-cheek joke anytime we get an email out asking for people who speak Mandarin or who speak Arabic or Portuguese or Turkish or what have you. It just, anytime that email comes up, we kind of monitor the frequency of that, and it really lament the fact that we don't have that kind of talent in-house, which also presents itself as a double-edged sword, I feel, because when you're so distinctly diverse, and in my case, visible, there's no way around me ever disassociating from my identity as a visibly Muslim woman, because that comes with its whole range and a whole set of preconceived notions about my background and my abilities as well, that also tend to be either over or underestimated. And that does play out because in that sense, depending on what kind of stories they are, most of the time I'm asked to translate things in Arabic, and they're most likely going to be interviews with terrorists who are incarcerated or some kind of news outlet reporting on some kind of terrorism subject that comes out of the Middle East. And that as a whole brings its own set of preconceived notions upon me. And whether that's something that I would be interested in doing. So in a way, having those conversations and like trying to broaden the perspective and being like, listen, I'm not from the Middle East, I'm not Lebanese, I don't live in Bankstown, I can't give you that kind of experience and knowledge, but I can expand in that sense to tell you that, you know, this demographic that I'm from is extremely diverse in and of its own right. And with that, we bring so much more to the table than just being off the key translators. We don't want to be reduced in that capacity just because we're so visibly diverse. And it's something I think what we're trying to push at least inside what I would like to see pushed, is that this effort of being bilingual can move beyond just your designated ethnicity. It's like a really handy skill set, especially if you're trying to work on the international news cycle or any kind of outlet that's, you know, that's covering an entire region. I think it's good for anyone to know on that. So it's a really, really interesting question. And I think it's a watch this space, definitely.
Yeah, absolutely. So my next question goes to both Ryma and Jarad. So have you found it easy to ask for the accommodation you need at work or for work? For example, Ryma, you know, allocating a time and space for prayers, for example, and Jarad, if you've ever asked for any assistive technology for your specific disabilities, and how successful has that been? We'll start with Jarad.
Oh, well, I haven't had to worry about spending that much money on assistive technologies, but I have been really reliant on using using the Samsung Galaxy Note smartphones, and these have been good. I've got the latest one, Note 20. And with these features that have been built into this device, it really helps to improve the way that I can engage in my work. And that includes knowing how for me to be able to write up scripts or cue sheets for the senior presenter, who also is the presenter and leading and senior producer of The Wire. We actually got two of them in our newsroom at Radio Adelaide, Annie Hastwell and Sarah Martin. And when I have to assemble or start creating my latest story and having to put all the pieces together, I need to plan out and pitch the story idea to Sarah, who's in charge of the show on Thursdays. Annie is responsible for it the day before on Wednesdays. And once we go through our pitch meeting, then I get right into working out who I can contact through my virtual or my digital Rolodex on my phone, or even going through my friends list on Facebook and trying to pick and choose who is going to be the person I'm going to feature in my story or report. Most times I don't really use my network. I do have to look and research more information about the origins of the story, the finer details, what, when, how, and why this has occurred, and what it is that we can get from the basics or the minimal or the minimal or the minimal amount of information from media releases or press releases that you could be able to conjure. And after you've done the work of gathering enough information to structure your questions and making the necessary arrangements to book an online interview, which I've had to do during the COVID-19 pandemic, as prior to having to stay at home to do pretty much close to over like 95% of my workload. I used to go to the studios on every Thursday or Wednesday. If it depends on it depends it depends whatever mood I was in, and I was able to do everything that I just described to you, but I was able to be more interactive with the senior producers and the other reporters and contributors who were there in our news team, right there within the upper level of Radio Adelaide. And even though we do have to flat share a lot of the facilities in the premises, as Fresh 92.7, which is another community radio station, occupies the same space. We have been able to adapt and to compromise when we do have to not be as so inconsiderate when we had to give up space, but when we make sure we make the appropriate arrangements and bookings, we can use the boardroom and the training studio and two of the production suites that are located downstairs. So to answer your question about assistive technologies, we may be the only disabled journalist / reporter / studio producer there on the team. We haven't really had to put that much investment in wanting to bring in technologies and software where we can be able to make things much more easier and much more comfortable for any disabled journalist to wanting to do their work without having to be reliant on other people. Like they want to be able to use enlarged text, or they can use automated automated voice software, or even they can use accessibility features that are inbuilt in mobiles or smartphones, like the one I got here in my hand. So you're going to be allowing yourself to plan ahead of how you're going to utilize these modern technologies to be able to be more productive in being more productive in submitting work for any media company or organization that you happen to be employed at. I do hope that everyone was able to understand that.
Yes, absolutely. Perfectly understandable. And it does seem like, with the advancements of technology, it's become so much more easier. You mentioned your phone, you mentioned the large text and all of these things.
Yeah, and laptops.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that. And we'll go to Ryma.
Yes, so thankfully, the ABC has been greatly accommodating. I didn't have to shy away from this kind of conversations. I kind of went back and forth, wondering as to how these kind of quote unquote demands or needs would be met, because they are so different. Like, for example, taking those extra days off for Eid because they happen to have it on a weekday, or trying to find a place to pray and whatnot. And I found that being upfront really helped, because it helped with my relationship with my managers, first of all. And second of all, when you've got an organization that's consciously trying to make that effort, in reality, what you come to realize later on is that you don't really need to actually fit yourself within the organization. I know that, for a lot of our previous, predecessors, or people who've been in this industry before who came from minority backgrounds, a lot of them felt like they had to leave part of themselves at the door in order to fit into the ethos or internal culture of the media outlet that they're working for. But it really is on the organization to accommodate and realize that if you're going to reflect contemporary Australia, then you're going to realize that contemporary Australia comes in many different forms and has many different needs. So they've been more than accommodating. They even at times they would bring it up before I'd even mention it. I remember in Melbourne on my induction, they were like, listen, there's a contemplation room, there's a place where you can wash up right next to it, we've got extra mats there for you, just let us know you need to take a 5-10 minute break, you can go on and head in that, because we know that things are different. Or switching up my working schedule during Ramadan, changing my work hours to try and make it home on time was a really big thing. I thought that was going to get pushed back, but they've been more than understanding. But I think that should be the norm and not the exception to the rule.
Yeah, absolutely. That's for sure. And it is so inviting to hear like how accommodating institutions are becoming as well. So my next question is for Emma. So have you ever been expected to write like a specific type of story that your supervisors assume of you? And have you ever experienced any tokenism or being backed into a corner with respect to the type of stories that you're allowed and expected to pitch and write?
Yes, it's only thankfully happened a handful of times. But during my time doing content writing in an office full of majority white people, I think, 90% white people, I was expected to, I had to be in this room and explain what Lunar New Year was, to write a piece of content about it. And it was really awkward for me as the only Asian person in the room that I felt that I had to explain my culture in a way, even though I'm not the expert about this, that everybody celebrates in a different way. Maybe it would be helpful if everyone did a bit of research before just turning to me and expecting me to carry that and explain it to everyone else. So yeah, look, it happens, and I haven't, and I think the flip side of that is that I've kind of, as a freelancer, I've kind of built up a reputation for wanting to write about Asian Australians and the diaspora here. So I've had editors specifically come to me and offer me stories about that, which is actually a good thing because I kind of wanted to have that be my niche. But at the same time, I didn't want to be pigeonholed as someone who can only write about identity or ethnic issues or whatever. So it's constantly, a matter of also pitching other stories that I wanted to write and to the same editor and letting them know that I had other topics that I was interested in.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the point you brought up about you want to write about your experiences and your individual traditions and things like that, but then you don't want to be backed into a place where that defines your entire writing. And I think, it's definitely an interesting thing to navigate both of those things. So thank you for that. So I wanted to ask Ella this question, but I'd like everyone to chip in if you can relate to it as well. So how has your experiences within the media industry changed from when you started to now? Do you find that newsrooms have gotten more diverse or better at handling diversity related topics, or has little progress been made?
I'm probably still fairly not super experienced, got about 8 years under my belt. So I think, I think with the emergence of Twitter and particularly with the Indigenous community that's super active on Twitter, there's definitely more of a culture of calling someone out. You're not going to get away with, for example, Sunrise's all white discussion of the stolen generation. That you can't get away with that stuff as easily anymore. People are going to call you out, hold you to account. So I think that's something that's become really big, and it's, it can be a support network and it can be something that holds people accountable. So I think that's something that has definitely changed throughout my time, and I've become more engaged with that. Broadly speaking, I guess, like I said before, the Herald and the Age, probably yes. I think that's, and they've got an editor there who's quite progressive, or she's quite invested in Indigenous affairs issues. So that's been, I think you can really feel that. So I haven't, I can't speak for what it was like before really, but like I said, there wasn't an Indigenous round for I don't know how many years before this. So I think the fact that that's been identified as an area that that needs to be covered and covered by an Indigenous journo in that kind of publication is important, and hopefully something that keeps going for a few years. So I think it's getting better, but I think, there's been a lot of talk with the whole Black Lives Matter movement, this, reckonings in different industries. And I think the media still has a bit of a way to go with that. And I think some of the other guys have touched on this as well, but in terms of making workplaces culturally safe for diverse journos and staff. So, and maybe the public broadcasters are slightly ahead of mainstream media there. But then we see, with stuff that's come out this year, that places like SBS still aren't perfect, but they're certainly miles ahead of other organisations. So I think it's changing slowly. I think there's a whole new younger generation coming up, and if we can get people up into those more management roles to have those discussions about framing stories, about hiring people, all of that. I think we're going to see a lot more change in the sort of decades to come. But yeah, I don't know, it's still pretty early days for me.
Yeah, there was a point you mentioned about how it's a lot harder to get away with things now. So you mentioned the Sunrise incident. How, after something like that does happen and people, you know, on social media, on Twitter, kind of, you know, are really vocal about their opinions, how effective do you think, you know, people in a large quantity kind of discussing things online, how effective do you think things like that are to actually enforcing some type of change in the future?
Well, it's a tricky balance, I guess. Like at NITV, we used to kind of joke about this, that there needs to be like a Black Media Watch kind of thing, because often that becomes a story, you know, if like for that Sunrise example, you know, that spurs on other stories. And I think once it becomes the story, that's going to make change. And NITV has done quite a few of these kind of stories calling people out for their bullshit reporting. But yeah, I guess then it's just a balancing act. Like, how much time do you want to dedicate to just going through and just calling people out? And, you know, while you're doing that, it's taking precious resources away from covering other stories and just doing things our way and doing it right. So I think it can have a real impact, and I think we've seen that, but it's just like, it's a bit exhausting, and I think it'll be better once it gets to the point where it's less frequent and it's people are more likely to get it right from the outset and to take more care when reporting on these kinds of issues. And hopefully they'll remember those incidents and go, oh no, that's right, that went to the press council or whatever and got called out, maybe we shouldn't do that again. So, and I guess it depends, you need the audience reaction too. I think if people watching breakfast TV or reading that paper or whatever react in, you know, say that this isn't what we want to see, we want to hear from the people who are directly affected by this, I think that's going to ultimately make a change too, if people stop reading or stop watching if it's not done the right way.
Yeah, absolutely. So my next few questions are just for everyone. So do you have any tips for dealing with kind of microaggressions or the day-to-day difficulties of dealing with prejudice and ignorance? We'll start with Emma.
I don't have great advice, only to not do what I do, which is get really flustered in the moment and then not say anything because I cannot find the words. But I mean, I think it's definitely worth at least trying to communicate that you have been made to feel very uncomfortable by someone's words, you know, whether that's through your body language at least, or like just saying something. And it's always really helpful to find a friend at work who gets it. But I will be taking notes as to what everyone else's advice is.
Yeah, absolutely. If we could hear from Jarad next.
Yeah, I wanted to interject in the previous question, but I can easily combine it with this one. I think when it comes to how we handle the language and the culture of how modern workplaces are and how they are assembled and how they are positioned in if they wanted to have more diverse and intersectional representation of producers and journalists. You don't want to go from the outset having to be fake or having to be so too involved and too making things too overdressed to seem that things are inclusive and progressive. When you know, if you when you chip away at the facade, you can see the cracks hiding underneath, showing the emotional anxieties and stresses and egos that just clash where there isn't enough room for them to keep away from a certain distance. And one of the things I got when I joined The Wire, doing what it is that I have been doing, when I became a permanent member of the team in Adelaide in 2018, we were lucky enough at one point in time to have about 3 disabled contributors in the newsroom. Well, I don't know how many there were in Sydney and Brisbane who also have a newsroom in their prospective community radio stations. But with The Wire and Radio Adelaide generally, or even prospectively, we had 3 exceptionally well-trained and qualified university graduates who wanted to stick their toes into this wild, dark, and unpredictable world of news journalism. And everyone wants to figure out where they're going to get their head start, and they choose radio, or they might want to choose a newspaper if they can be able to get an internship or a cadetship that is offered to them, or if it is available to apply for it. And that was how I was able to become involved with the program after I submitted an application to do a 2-week internship back in November 2017. So all that aside, I do think it is about not letting yourself be taken advantage of, and not letting someone coerce you into behaving as someone that you don't want to be. And don't ignore or let any defamatory or discriminatory behaviour or language go unreported or even unchallenged, because we do not need bigots to make the whole experience of being involved in journalism a chore, because it should be a fantastic, exuberant adventure to be able to help to write, to become a very avid storyteller and storyteller and reporter who can give a platform for marginalized communities who would have not have had that avenue to hear their stories previously.
Yeah, absolutely. I really like your point of, just not letting anything go unreported. I think, when we do use the kind of platforms where that have been set out for us to report things, we definitely should use them. So thank you for that. If we could hear from Ella, would you have any thoughts about this?
Sorry, I was so engrossed in that answer that I forgot what the question was. If you could remind
me. No, not a problem. So do you have any tips for dealing with microaggressions or the day-to-day difficulties on dealing with prejudice and ignorance?
Yeah, so it's probably something I'm still learning as well. I think if you know that you're going to be in the minority in a workplace, I think if you can somehow firstly build some sort of support for yourself, whether it's having a mentor that might be outside your organisation or having someone within the organisation that you feel like you can trust and bounce ideas off or just vent to. I think that's a really good starting point to sort of protect yourself a little bit. But yeah, I think it's hard because I think it is good. You should raise those issues wherever you can, but that can be really hard sometimes, and sometimes it's not well received. I think I've always tried to, I haven't encountered a lot of overt racism, which is, I've been really lucky in that regard. But I think for me, it's been more just personal interactions, and it's usually quite well-meaning, and you can have a conversation and sort of explain, okay, this is why that's maybe not the preferred term, or this is offensive for this reason. So I think that's the kind of most simple way doing it at that level. We have sort of tried to have a broader conversation around cultural safety and awareness and all that sort of stuff. And I think, honestly, my experience with it so far has been that you raise those issues and it just gets lost in a HR department. So I don't know, when you're in those bigger organisations, I'm still figuring out how to break through that. I think just if you can get, even if you can reach out to other people that might be feeling the same way you are, and sort of go take that as your concerns as a group to a manager that you think might be receptive to listening to you. That would probably be my best advice in sort of actually making some progress. But yeah, open to any other tips.
Thanks for that. And then finally, Ryma as well, could we hear from you?
Yeah, this is like a fraught question because I'm the type of person that cannot stay silent even if I wanted to. If I find something that infuriates me because it's wrong or it's misrepresenting aspects of my community, I am hyper aware of that purely because of the history that my community has, not only with its fraught relationship with the media, but the fact that my very image and the image of other women, for example, and men in my community is highly politicized to the point where just using a picture wrongly or misplacing it in the wrong context has negative impacts and ramifications that can result in potential violence or intimidation towards someone else in my community. And it's very much walking a fine line and a double-edged sword in accordance with that, because even though it comes across as microaggressions, to me, it's symptoms of a bigger problem that's happening structurally. That's not going to be solved if I just tell this one person who isn't able to affect any change, hey, you know, your knowledge about this particular aspect of religion or this area is completely wrong. I don't know where you got your information from. It's really hard. And at times, I'm sure everyone here can empathize. It's really exhausting trying to do that unpaid labor of, you know, being brought in to, you know, increase or at least benefit the organization that you're in, diversity wise, and trying to bring in these new perspectives and ideas. But structurally, you're also brought in to fix these problems, and one person can't undo years and decades worth of institutionalized thinking and, you know, and decision making. So it's a lot for one person to take. I've always tried to be upfront with it because I've had great mentors who've supported me, like Karen here and Lynette, who is also of a diverse background, who is my manager at legal. Having someone who is experienced with management can also take it up, but it's obviously part of a bigger overhaul in terms of how do we change this institution. It's perceptible to change. It's not something that's definite. It has to adapt in the future. We have to strike at the right moment. And this is a very pivotal moment because we're having these discussions. And not only that, like with internal forums and stuff, there is a real concerted effort to do that. But we also need to, again, reinforce that we need to recruit the right kind of people. There are talented people out there. And once we're able to reflect that in the institution itself is when we actually affect real change. But boy, that's a lot of work. It is a lot of work. And I can see why, you know, for me personally, it's been a struggle because at the time that I got in, finding someone like me per se and was incredibly difficult because they've all left the industry for that particular reason. It was just too much. So that's a big motivation for me to stay and also know what's at stake, not only just for future journalists coming up to be able to be that source, hopefully in the future, because I only have 3 years under my belt, not too much going on there, but I hope to be in the future. But also, I'm also doing this with the added purpose of properly representing and getting those stories out that are coming from my community done with the right kind of nuance and attention to detail and respect that it deserves, and also putting it on that platform to be heard.
Yeah, absolutely. That was very well said. So we're going to move to audience questions now. So we've got a question from Karen. She's directed it to everyone, but specifically to Ella. So as a senior journo, I would like to know what is needed in the industry in newsrooms for organizations to better support diverse journalists. If you have specific ideas in particular, I would like to hear them.
Yeah, I think it comes back to this idea of having a culturally safe workspace. And I think a lot of particularly mainstream organisations, that's still a very foreign concept. And it's something that's hard to even explain to people who've never come across that sort of thing before. So I don't know, I think this is like a whole space that someone needs to fill. Like, I don't know, Media Diversity Australia is doing really great work. So I don't know if it's something that they can look at, because I feel like this is something that a lot of
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got a question for Emma from Nathan. So he's saying, as an Asian Australian myself, I would just like to know, what roles do they offer to you? Have you noticed Asian Australians given specific roles? I ask this question as I've noticed there are not many writers or presenters that are of an Asian background online or on television. So are there any specific roles that are given to this community?
Probably can't speak to the television and radio side. I mean, in my experience, when I was starting out and trying to build my portfolio, I felt like one of the only ways I could maybe get my foot in the door was if I wrote about my personal experience, which I don't think should really be the right way. I don't want other people to feel that way. But at the time there was, demand for stories about identity and culture and that kind of thing. And the easiest thing you can do when you're a young writer at that point is just write about yourself. But yeah, that's not really necessary. But your question was, what kind of jobs do they give you? Personally, I haven't been super pigeonholed really at all. For me, it was just about finding, finding out what I enjoyed reporting on, what I enjoyed writing about. When I was freelancing for Vice, I felt like I could just notice, I could get into certain spaces actually a bit easier because I'm Asian, and like people would think that I was Chinese as well. So I could get into, I could like speak to like Chinese students, and they kind of just were more receptive to me. And weren't like as thrown off by this stranger approaching them. So there are some things you can use to your advantage on that like day-to-day level, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that, Emma.
Your question?
Sorry, what was that?
Oh, I was just asking if I answered your question, Nathan. All good.
Okay, perfect.
You did. You did. Sorry. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Nathan. We've got a question for Jarad. So do you have advice on creating a diverse independent media platform, such as a documentary style Vox Pop brand on YouTube that lifts up marginalized and or underrepresented voices? This is from Elena. She's saying, I just don't like the idea of dealing with higher ups and having restrictions placed upon me in a more traditional work environment. And how do you feel about the potential of entrepreneurial ideas such as this could have on creating job opportunities and diversifying the industry in Australia? For example, the wider reach online platforms have internationally. So I'd love to hear from Jarad, but if anyone else wants to chip in as well, that would be great.
Yeah, well, it's all to do with having the skills and capabilities to be your own multimedia operator and content creator. You have to have the energy and the tenacity and the endurance and perseverance to put yourself out there to develop and build your own media empire. everyone can do it, and even I could. I've dabbled in developing, hosting my own podcast this year called What's the Quarantine, and that's all about hearing stories from people who have been caught up, or I think everyone's been caught up with this whole, with the COVID-19 pandemic. But for those who unfortunately had to stay at home because of lockdown, and I spent not that many weeks or months searching or even scouting for particular people to wanting to express or divulge their own perspectives and narrations about their life, how they were before or during, or how they think life is going to be after the pandemic has passed. So I do think that you need to put a lot of effort into knowing what you want to give, what it is you want to promote and advertise to your audience. And if you want to make your content intersectional, diverse, inclusive, but not wanting to be too wishy-washy or preachy, but wanting to be engaging, informative, and even provocative in trying to convey or trying to establish a story about something that's happened in your community. So you're going to just be your own boss and be your own person. And what I'm really enjoying hearing from the other panelists tonight is every person, every journalist, reporter, producer, or media practitioner is capable of controlling their own decision-making and not allowing stereotypes or misconceptions to dictate how someone can think, what your contributions or what your role or what the capabilities are within your role in any organization. That can include having to contend with ableist or in my case, ableist and or homophobic vitriol or rhetoric or even or attitudes which they may not intentionally meant to make you feel that they don't want you there, but sometimes it does feel like they don't know how to get their heads around and to acquaint themselves with someone who is not like them, who isn't from the status quo, who is not predominantly white or heteronormative or neurotypical. So you need to step back and to not to allow yourself to be conformed to these stereotypes and these misperceptions of how you identify your co-worker or colleague, because first impressions is the key. But you can't be reliant on information that is not truthful or accurate.
Yeah, absolutely. That was really well said, Jared. We've got a question for Ryma from Sue.
Just add to something.
Of course.
Jared had a really great answer. I think my other advice is, like, I'm all for people starting their own thing and experimenting, and just, you can do that so cheaply and for free these days that I just think, why not at this point, even if it, doesn't necessarily go anywhere, but it's always worth it. And it helps you to find your own voice as well. And my other tip for that is just don't forget that there is funding for those kinds of things out there if you are interested in taking it further. So, things like creative arts grants, in your state there would be a variety of them, but if you like, I could point you towards some if you ever want to go down that route, because I've kind of been through that process as well.
Thank you for that, Emma. I was just about, I've forgotten about funding your own enterprise or business property. I should have realized that, but no, you totally answered that very well.
Okay, thank you for that, guys. We've got a question from Susie for Ryma. So she's saying, if you ever do start these conversations, so discussions regarding racism, misjudgment, assumptions, do you find that they are welcome, belittled, or entirely shut down?
That is a great question. And just to echo off the previous point, I totally second independent platforms and trying to build an empire. I'm all for it. Let's do it. The media industry is too saturated as it is. I think it deserves a little shake up here and there. As speaking from someone from personal experience, I lead the content development team for Podium, which is specifically a mini media organization that's running outside of Melbourne, dedicated for Muslim youth specifically. So providing a platform for them to really get into issues that they care about and want to see discussed, both within and externally, outside of the community as well. So I can definitely attest to the fact that it's invaluable to have those kinds of avenues and resources available to you to further project that and get that stuff out there, because it's great. In terms of bringing up those conversations, they're incredibly difficult. I can say that for the beginning, I think because, as I'm sure with anyone who probably started around the same time as I have, which was around like 2016, 2017, even though there was discussion about it, there was still this hesitancy, from myself included, about any repercussions or backlash to bringing that up. So you would just kind of let it slide, because for me in particular, my biggest fear was if I said something, I would upset the status quo, and I would lose this great opportunity that I had. So I didn't want to rock the boat too much, because when I looked around in both newsrooms, I didn't find anyone who looked like me or who's working with me who could actually connect on that level. So I said, you know what, it might be some kind of teething issues. It might just be issues with individuals. But as I've come to realize, it's wider discussions that need to be had organization-wise. But having a collective voice as well does like magic, especially if it's on your own. Sure, if you're able to speak to certain issues that only impact you specifically because you're from a particular type of minority, for sure. But when you've got a collective group that's able to support you, like having support networks there, like for example, ABC Belong has come out in the past year. So it's really about having diverse colleagues basically band together and have that forum to really discuss that, and not only that, have access to management to discuss that as well. And because of this concerted effort, from personal experience, HR is really leading out and really keen on hearing experiences, whether they be good, bad, or ugly, about how this is working out. So it's definitely easier. You're not going to get fired, as I would have thought, in the first year or so. But I think, once we get over as well, for me personally, I do have an inferiority complex that I'm constantly battling with, because I'm just thinking, someone else can do it better. Someone else can speak to this and really advocate for this properly, more or less, replaceable. I don't think so, especially if we're trying to reflect a contemporary Australia and the organisations are paying attention to that. So there may be some belittling in the past, but I don't think we can afford to do that anymore. So it's a good time to have those clear, honest conversations.
Thank you for that, Ryma. We've got a question for, let me just find it. We've got a question for everyone from Megan. What do you wish the general public knew about working in the media industry today? And what might you say to someone from a diverse background considering a career in the media? Should we start with Ella?
Yeah, it was going to come back to the alphabetical.
Yeah.
Every time. I don't know. I was trying to think about how to answer that first question about what I wish the public knew. So I don't want to let the media off the hook, but sometimes I think that when you tarnish everyone with the same brush. The media can get a bad rap. I mean, the media gets a lot of stuff wrong, but also there are journos out there. Not everyone's in it just for a great headline. I think there are plenty of journos who are there because they genuinely want to make a positive impact or help, foster education and understanding. And that's been my experience, particularly when you're talking about places like NITV. So we're not all bad, I guess, is like the short answer, but also be wary and do your research of who's interviewing you if you're involved in that. But yeah, in terms of if you're thinking about a career in media, 100% do it. I think with the caveat that it's probably going to be hard depending what route you take, and be prepared for that. Like I said before, try to build those support networks. And if you're an Indigenous journo, I couldn't recommend enough starting out in community media, somewhere like NITV, or if there's somewhere, community radio or somewhere within your local town that's community led. I think for me that I would have struggled, I think, without that, without having that grounding, particularly before going to a more mainstream environment. I think, that was really important for me. And yeah, just do it and get as much experience as possible. I guess that's pretty generic advice, but just start getting work experience under your belt as soon as you can, read widely, all of that.
Thank you for that, Ella. We've got a question for Jarad from Caitlin. She's saying, at what point in the job application process do you think people with disabilities, particularly invisible disability, should, if at all, disclose their disability to the employer?
Oh, 2 questions for the audience. I am being spoiled. Yeah, what should you do if... can you better tell me the question again? Sorry.
Okay, I'll just read it back to you. So at what point in the job application process do you think people with disabilities, particularly invisible disabilities, should disclose their disability to their employer?
Yeah. When at what exact time should a potential employee or candidate who's going for any job in journalism or in broadcasting should confide or disclose their disability, whether they happen to have a visible or invisible condition? Well, I just feel for me, because I can only relate to my own experiences and what I had to go through. I have applied for a couple of initiatives at the ABC, well, 2 of them. One was the media cadetship program, and then my final year of uni, I tried to get into their work experience program, but I didn't get through to the final stage of the interviewing process because a lot of the questions kind of felt very intrusive, invasive, and patronizing in the way of how can you describe this particular scenario as a person with a disability. And I actually read someone that I know in the disability community has gone for a position as a specialist. I think it's a specialist producer at the public broadcaster. And she was concerned about how the way the whole process kind of is kind of structured against the person with a disability, despite putting you on top of the list of potential candidates to interview. Some could misconstrue that or being pandered to, or being made out that, oh yeah, we're going to interview this person, find out what their credentials or qualifications are, and just tick a box on the number of disabled prospective candidates who have a disability. Whether it is invisible or visible, we can say that we consider them as a part of our during the judging panel component of the whole process. But still, you do feel like that you are not considered and you are pushed aside for someone who may not have the level of experience and or expertise that you feel that you have conveyed to the person responsible for hiring the person to get to fill this position. And it's not just with the ABC or SBS, it can be with mainstream media outlets too, which is why I would say if you want to disclose your disability, just be cautious and do a little, just make sure to do some additional research on the organisation, their policies and protocols, and just get a good get a good sense of what the culture is. Do they emphasize? Are they supportive of cultural diversity and intersectionality? And what processes and procedures are there if you feel that you are going to be ostracized, or you're not going to be you're not going to be assigned to do a pitch for a major story on the front page, or being the leading story for a radio news and current affairs program, or even wanting to write a blog post for the aforementioned media media organization or business. You're going to make sure that you're not going to get taken advantage of. You're not going to be coerced, or you're not going to be forced to behave as you don't want to be, as you might project as your own self outside of the newsroom environment. So you've got to make sure that you pay attention to your surroundings, and don't beeline yourself to being second best. Don't feel that you have to take a position or role where it doesn't value your potential as a journalist or a reporter, or even a producer or media practitioner. Don't beguile. Don't sever yourself from the equation. Be sure to be persistent and communicate, and to talk to your employer about how you can make the whole experience being in this workplace much more comfortable and safer. And I think it can be like that for anyone, including those who are Indigenous, a person of color, or even those who are women, or those who are transgender or non-binary and gender fluid, and even for other members of the LGBTQIA community, because we should not be capitulated as a stereotype or a label. We are much more than that, and we need to advance those avenues and those opportunities to let future generations to consider journalism or broadcasting a suitable, appropriate profession to wanting to join in, or to wanting to study for, or to train.
Yeah, absolutely. That was really well said, Jarad. I really liked your point of how, people do sometimes diversity is down to just filling a quota, so they can write on a piece of paper like, yes, we've got this amount of people from this group and we're done. But there's definitely a lot more work to do than just that.
Yes,
I think,
and we need to go beyond quotas and having to fill any initiatives where they want to make their organisations more diverse and inclusive and intersectional. But you have to mean it. It's got to be legitimately structurally sound. You cannot offer or even advertise a role or position where you feel you're going to be taken advantage of, you're going to be exploited. You should not let yourself be put in such a precarious, dangerous position.
Absolutely. I think your point there is a really good segue to our final question from the audience. We've got a final question from Susie, and I'll open it up to everyone. So how can you tell if the people you're working for are being performative or actually want to make changes? Because I think specifically this year with the Black Lives Matter movement, we have seen there's so many companies that, you know, they'll prepare like a perfect little marketing image that they post on their social medias, and then you don't really hear anything beyond that. So whoever wants to jump in, I'd love to hear your responses.
I mean, I think for me, I'm always thinking about, yeah, sure, you posted this image on your Instagram, but who are your contributors? Who are you paying? Who are you commissioning? Are they representative? Are they a diverse group of people? And then again, who works for the organization as well. So it always pays to be skeptical, of course, about those kinds of, but yeah, if it strikes you as performative, you can definitely do a bit of digging and find out how diverse an organization actually is.
Yeah, thanks for that, Emma. Ella, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think I'd just back up exactly what Emma said. I think it's, if you're looking from the outside in, I think you're looking at what that person or organisation does rather than what they say. I think people, even governments, have gotten really good at saying all the right things and getting the language right because they've listened and learned. But yeah, you want to look for people or organisations that are putting that into practice, whether that's, you know, with the stories that they're producing or the people who are in those upper management positions, that sort of thing. I think within the workplace, you get to know pretty quickly, again, just based on the stories people write, the way people react to your pitches, the story suggestions they're making to you. And it's always kind of, you know, I think in any new workplace, you sort of have to suss that out a bit in the first weeks or months and then kind of, you know, navigate around that as you can. So yeah, I think that's about all I would have to add on that.
Thank you. And Ryma, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think we can actually also move beyond just finding out whether they're performative or not, and then move the conversation to, well, what are we going to do about it? How are we going to make sure that we're on top of them to affect change? And the greatest example for me that I've seen play out, well, it's great in the sense of like, you're actually getting to see this play out in real time. And it's the fallout of Bon Appetit that happened in June of this year and is still ongoing, right? We were all just, you know, watching this great YouTube channel with these fantastic personalities, and, you know, we're not even paying attention to the recipes that they're making. We're just there for them. And all it took was just one person in the name of Sola Awali to really expose an entire culture. But we also get to see how poorly Condé Nast have been handling this, even though key figures have resigned and, you know, people think that's it, it's done and dusted. There are so many things that were happening in the background, right, where we saw Sola is no longer going to be on Face Personality. She's moved to the magazine, and so many others have moved in as well. So we're actually getting to see a litmus test of how seriously media outlets are taking this in terms of affecting actual change. And because it's being exposed to not only the general public in the US, it's the world, because, you know, as much as the push for nationalism has been evolving in politics, that we see a latter half, you know, taking place where we're becoming so much more interconnected than ever in a globalized internet society. And we now have, you know, the people power to keep organizations to account. So this can no longer be performative. It can start out as that, but we're now able to mobilize and put pressure to affect change, which is what I'm really interested in. And so I'll be paying attention quite keenly as to how this plays out in Australia in the not too distant future, I hope.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I think that is a really good point that you mentioned, that that is one of the benefits of social media. It is like an international platform, and it does, as you said, allow people to be held accountable. So I think that's all the questions we've got for everyone today. I want to thank all our panelists, Ella, Ryma, Emma, and Jarad for joining us today. Thank you for, all the wisdom you've shared with us. And I look forward to hopefully meeting you guys in person one day as well. Yeah.